start recording. All right, let's see. Two. All right, we'll do who's online first. Quicker. That way, maybe. Harrison is online. King is online. Wilcox is online. James is online. Linda Q is online. Bonner is online. So far, that's it for online. So let's see. Aki is not here. Boggs is not here. Bonner is online, like I already said. Clay is not here. Dawson is not here. Ellis is not here. Castro is not here. Green is not here. Harrison is online. Henson is here. James is online. Kesterson's not here. King is online. Lewis is not here. Oh, sorry, yeah. Lewis is here in person. Linda Q is online. Morrison's not here. Grace is not here. Ward is not here. Wilcox is online. Wilder is here. Dan Parks is not here yet. Key is online. So since we're recording, I know it's early, but we only have like less than 3 minutes. So I'll go ahead and start some stuff, some reminders since it's recording. For independent work, again, it's due by Friday. And so people are making mistakes. And I put this out on an announcement, a written announcement. Make sure you read your announcements, but if you mess up from now on, I just can't grade your stuff. So if you use AI or you plagiarize, even if it's on accident, if you send something in, I'm just going to send it back like that's a 0, because I just don't have time. Because most of you have waited to do any independent work. So you got to imagine, I might have hundreds of papers to read. So because of that, like I said, if you screw up a paper, I'm not even going to, usually I will write back, like, hey, do you have a source for this fact? Do you have a source for that? This time, if you don't, I'm just going to write it back and like, this one's a 0, try again. Not because I'm trying to be strict or mean or whatever. I literally just don't have time. That being said, when you write a paper, like I said, there's different ways to do it. If you just want a quick 1-point paper, that's not even a paper, just send me an email and say, hey, I looked up this question. Here's the answer according to the source. Then you don't have to worry about plagiarizing. Like you can literally copy and paste what the source says. According to this source, this is how turkeys are classified, whatever it may be, right? So you can just get 1 point for that, nice and easy, just send me an email. Or you can write papers. And here's where most people screw this up. Well, first of all, again, don't use AI, don't plagiarize. But if you write a paper about something, you're going to summarize a source, like a website that you're interested in. My suggestion, just to make sure you don't screw this up, is read it as many times as you can and then just write it from memory. You probably won't have as long as the paper, but that's okay. Then you won't mess it up and accidentally plagiarize. We have one student, I won't say who, but a really good student just can't seem to grasp this and keeps turning stuff in. We're like, it seems like they copied it, pasted it, and then went in and changed a few words to make it their own, right? Like change some adjectives. It's still sentence for sentence, the same thing as their source. They just changed some words, and that is against the rules. That's plagiarizing. So make sure you don't do that. If you need help, let me know. But like I said, best way to do it, I think, if you're going to try to summarize a source is to just read it as many times as you can. Take little notes if you have to, not like sentences, just like 1 to 2 words at a time, and then write your paper from memory. It's my suggestion. You don't have to do it that way, but I highly recommend it. whatever you do, don't use AI. I'm telling you. And people have been screwing with us for about a year now. But yeah, AI is really bad. Like if you say, write me a paper on this subject and include your sources, it will do that. But then you have to go in, and I'm telling you, every single thing in your paper, you've got to make sure that you actually have a source for it, because they screw that up all the time. So yeah, first of all, I'm saying don't use AI. But if you do, which you're not supposed to, you need to go through every single word in your paper and compare it to your source. Which, to be honest with you, I'm not even that against that, because that would actually be more work than writing your own paper. If you have to sit there and read the whole source and, read your paper, you would actually learn quite a bit from that. So, again, I'm saying don't use AI, but if you do, like I said, that's the thing you should do. Go through your paper word for word, compare it word for word to your source, and make sure everything is correct. Like I said, if you mess it up, I'll just send you an email back and said 0 for that paper. Not because I'm trying to be strict, I just don't have time. Any questions about independent work? All right, if you need help too, like if you just need inspiration, or don't feel bad if you even though I've been saying it, I get you in a second, all semester long, if you still have a question, like I know you told me this, but can you tell me again? Send me an email, maybe online, don't feel bad, let me help you if you need help. Yes, sir.
So when's the last day we can turn it in?
I'll check the syllabus, but I'm pretty sure it's Friday.
This Friday?
Yeah. And again, like I said, don't feel bad. If you want to sit down and we're getting ready to start writing some papers. If you need help, let me know. I don't care if I said it a million times. I don't mind repeating myself. Just let me know. What else? So lab this week is very easy. We're not going to meet. Some of you don't even really need to do anything. Basically, I'm going to take your highest grade that you have in lab and reapply it. So the only thing you'll need to do, if anything, if you want to say I'd rather retake this lab or redo this lab to improve the grade, then send me an email and let me know, yeah, I'm going to redo this one. That'd be fine. But otherwise, I'm just going to take your highest grade and, recycle. That make sense? So I'm just trying to make things easy. I want you guys to be focusing on independent work and kind of fun. What else? Some people missed the due dates last week. I extended them, I guess, by 2 weeks. So, for example, the quiz 7 is now due on Wednesday. So if you missed it, go ahead and take it. Actually, anything that you missed over the past week, from that week, let me know, and if I'll extend the due dates if you need to. But I think that's it. There's only the lab and quiz. So yeah, you should be good. Any questions about that? Sweet. All right. Oh yeah, and one last reminder: we are not meeting online on Wednesday. It's in person only, because we've got to do student evaluations. So if you're here, if you're here, you'll get double the extra credit that you usually get, and if you're online, you just get 0, right? Because we're not meeting online. Any questions about that? Okay. So it's been a while. Hopefully you guys remember this, but we were talking about ways that we can, first of all, let me back all the way up. This chapter, we're talking about population ecology, right? So, which is basically looking at how a population changes, right? How the size of a population changes, and the things that cause that population change, or population size to change. Then we started getting into this section, which was talking about the ways we can actually use population ecology, right? So we're basically done talking about how population ecology works. Now we're talking about how it can be used. And this example that we used for sustainable resource management was the fishing industry. And if you'll remember, one of the last things I talked about last week was when you're talking about sustainable resource management, and I drew this little graph, I'll try it again. Actually, speaking of which, now I'll just draw it again. All right, so if you were to look at a population, it grows up first, that's a J-shaped curve, right? It's exponential growth. Then it starts evening off towards carrying capacity, which is right what that is, right? And that's logistic growth. What you're shooting for is this area right here, right between 0 and carrying capacity. That's the highest growth rate, right? So that's what you're shooting for. So here's just an example from the old textbook. If you are the person in charge of this North Atlantic cod fishery, right, you have to set rules. Like, all right, you can only go fishing from this date until this date. And you can only catch this many pounds of fish. And each fish has to be this big. And if it's not this big, you need to return it to the water, right? All these different rules, because this is what you're shooting for, right? You want to catch as many fish as possible, but also without depleting the population. So if you see here, this is a real life example. I'm going to ask you any questions about this, but you can see what happened to this fish population, right? It was good, it was like that for decades, and then finally it collapsed in the mid-90s because someone screwed something up, right? Someone, as we'll talk about here, sustainable catch rates cannot be estimated without knowing the life history traits. So this is a good time to remind you, because we talked about that, you do need to know about life history traits, like, how long does something typically live? At what age does it typically first reproduce? At what age is it most vulnerable? When it does reproduce, how many offspring does it have? What is the distance or the time between how many times they can reproduce? So those are life history traits, right? And you need to know these things to be able to set the rules for these fisheries. But they didn't know them, right? They didn't know them like they thought they did. So basically, because of that, because of a lot of different reasons, we ended up, and again, let me back it up. We ended up with the collapse of the fishing industry. Any questions about that example of sustainable resource management? All right, first word for attendance is happy. Like Happy Gilmore, or I'm happy we only have 1 week of class left. Actually, that's not true. Last week is always the hardest for me. Anyway, this brings us into what I find to be a very interesting topic, which is invasive species. Because again, we're talking about applications of population ecology, and this is one of them. Let me get the door over here for Kesterson. Hello.
Hello. Bus is waiting for you.
You didn't miss too much. If you get a chance, oh no, you're done with it. You're good. I did explain the lab, so if you have any questions about lab or anything, how things are going to work for the past week or last week, just let me know later, and I'll catch you up. Anyway, invasive species. Let's talk about them. This one is very interesting to me. What is an invasive species? You will need to know this for the examples. Organisms that are introduced to non-native habitats that have a devastating effect on the ecosystem. Or really, it should say organisms introduced to non-native habitats that can have a devastating effect on the ecosystem. So you need to know that definition. As always, not verbatim, right? You just need to know what those words mean. I might not use the same exact words, which brings me to another good independent work topic. And I forgot to even say this when we first started, but as a reminder, one great independent work topic is like you take something that I've given you and say, according, your PowerPoint or your textbook, whatever, said, this is the definition of invasive species. I looked it up, and according to this source, this is the definition of invasive species. And then just maybe do a sentence or two and talk about how they're different and how they're the same. Very easy, very, not just easy, but it's a good way to avoid plagiarism or making you think that you used AI, because that's very straightforward, right? You directly quote me or your textbook, you directly quote your source, and then you use your own words for a sentence or two to just talk about how these things are the same or different. Because again, like I keep saying, one of the big purposes of college education is you should be thinkers. Think for yourself, question everything, including me in this textbook. Yes, sir.
Can we do one on something about invasive species, let's say from South Florida, I can do one about invasive species in South Florida.
Yes, that would be such a good one. And there's so many things like the Burmese pythons and the Everglades, lionfish and the Keys, the freaking iguanas, so many.
We can write a paper about that.
Yeah. Anyway, so again, that's what they are, non-native, but they have to have a devastating effect on the ecosystem too to be considered invasive. So invasive and non-native, not exactly the same. For example, if I take an alligator from South Florida, for example, and I bring it up to Alaska and set it free in a lake, it's probably not going to make it. So yes, it's non-native, but it's not invasive because it's not going to thrive, right? An invasive species is non-native, but it's also spreading far beyond its original point of introduction, which the alligators wouldn't do, right? They would just die in the cold waters of Alaska. And they cause environmental or economic damage by colonizing and dominating suitable habitats. So this is a really interesting example. Kesterson wrote a paper about this, if I remember correctly. These are called Asian carps. If you click any of those pictures, those little videos, or maybe it's just the one on the right. Yeah, if you click this one on the right, if you download the PowerPoint, there's a little video you can watch. So these things are crazy. I don't know if you've seen them, but as boats drive, for whatever reason, that sound and vibrations of the engine freaks the fish out. And it's hard to see in this projection, but fish are jumping out of the water. People have to wear helmets and stuff because they get hit in the face. In this picture on the right, this guy's got like protective equipment on and he's getting pulled like he's skiing, and he's got a net so he catches the fish and then dumps them into a bucket. Anyway, that's just an example. I'm obviously not going to ask you anything about Asian carps, but I think they're one of the more entertaining of the invasive species. Yeah, but there's lots of them to write about. You can look up hippopotamuses in South America because they're native to Africa. But Pablo Escobar, the drug king, with all that money, he imported hippopotamuses into South America, and now they're an invasive species. Anyway, let's give you some more stats. Now, I'm going to ask you this, but in the U.S., there's hundreds of invasive species. That includes plants, mammals, birds, fishes, arthropods, mollusks, even fungi. For example, we don't have American chestnut trees. We used to have them all over the place, and they were actually there was an industry because of the chestnuts themselves. But there was a blight, which is a fungal infection, that pretty much wiped them all out. Anyway, the estimated cost of invasive species in the United States alone is $137 billion a year. That's a lot. As I was mentioning earlier, just because they're introduced doesn't necessarily make them invasive, so not everything that's been introduced will become invasive. And there is no single explanation of why non-native species turn into a damaging pest, but invasive species typically exhibit opportunistic life history patterns. That is something you need to know for the exam. So as far as the exam is concerned, that's probably the most important bullet point. They typically exhibit an opportunistic life history pattern. And like he was saying, yes, that's a really good topic, I think. For me, anyway, I would find that interesting. What are some invasive species from where you're from, or just some area that you're interested in? And they don't always have to be animals. For example, for you, in South Florida, there's an invasive tree called the Brazilian pepper tree, Brazilian pepper plant, something like that. Anyway, I think that's where it was introduced to South Florida, and then it kind of spread from there. And then here, we've got what's a big one that we have to deal with a lot this time of year? Stink bugs. Well, they're kind of dead now, but anyway, stink bugs is a good example around here. Cats. Domestic cats are invasive species. You look that up, write a paper about that. They're one of the worst invasive species. Outdoor cats are horrible for the environment. Anyway, let me give you some examples from the book. Not that I'm going to ask you this, but these are great examples, so I love talking about them. This is maybe from the old textbook, but again, either way, I might not ask you any questions specifically about this. The cheatgrass is an invasive plant of the arid western United States, and it covers millions of acres that are formerly dominated by native grasses and sagebrush. This is why I love this example, because you might, common sense doesn't necessarily work here, right? So imagine you're not from the arid western United States. You go out to visit, and someone says, look at this field, look at these millions of acres out here full of cheatgrass. If it was me, I'd be like, oh, that looks great, right? Plants are good. Plants are great for the environment. Look at all those plants. So again, this is not necessarily intuitive, right? Because cheatgrass is not from that area. So it is good as it might look. It might seem like it's good because it's plants, but it's not. So let's talk about what makes it invasive. First of all, it produces seeds earlier than all the plants around it, right? So it has a heads up that way, right? It's reproducing before the native plants. Not only is it doing it before the native plants, but it's doing it in greater abundance than the native plants, right? So it's out-competing them in that way. Also, it matures in the early summer, which makes it become extremely dry and flammable. And this creates abundant fuel that is easily ignited by lightning and stray sparks. We'll keep talking about this on the next slide. Now, cheatgrass fires are different than fires when you have native plants because they're more intense and they're more frequent. Therefore, the native plants aren't used to it. They're not evolved to deal with these more intense and more frequent fires. And again, just to remind you of something we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, I gave you that example of the woodpecker, how they actually needed fire, natural fires for them to live. Same here, right? So you might think of fire as a bad thing, and it is a bad thing, but if it's natural and it's supposed to be there. In this case, again, the fires are more intense and they're more frequent. So after just a few fire cycles, then pretty much all the native plants have been eliminated, right? Because again, they're out-competing them with reproduction, and they're also out-competing them by their ability to survive these fire cycles. And once again, I love this example because it goes beyond common sense. Because you might just think, okay, so we used to have a bunch of plants, a bunch of different species, but now we still have a bunch of plants, except it's the same, just one species. So you might think, what's the matter? Well, when you lose the native plants, we also lose over 150 species of birds and mammals who are now without food and shelter. So again, that goes beyond common sense, I think, right? This is where knowing population ecology helps, because you don't know these things, right? Anyway, climate change also hastens the transition of rangeland to field to cheatgrass. Why? Because cheatgrass responds greater to increased carbon dioxide levels than the native grasses. They grow faster, they accumulate more tissue, and that, of course, makes more fuel for more fires, which again helps them outcompete the native plants. So once again, a big old X here reminding you, I'm not going to ask you questions about that. It's just a great example of an invasive species. And again, because some of this is not common sense. Some of this you actually have to study population ecology to even understand it's a bad thing. Here's what it looks like. Another example, I'm just going to go through this really quickly because, again, it's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it on the exam. But I mentioned it earlier, Burmese pythons. So people have these things in South Florida as pets. They don't want them anymore, so they think the nice thing to do is to set them free into the Everglades. And in a sense, they're right. That is the nice thing to do to the snake. But then the whole ecosystem's now screwed because these pythons are eating birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, all these other things that are not evolved to avoid them, right? They are a predator that all the prey is not evolved to avoid. So anyway, that's just another example. I'll put another X through this as an indication that I'm not going to ask you any questions. And it looks like this. If you download the PowerPoint and click that picture of the python, it looks like it take you to a website that has a video of people from India who have come to the Everglades to hunt these things. Anyway, any questions about that? All right, the next one's pretty straightforward too. I'm gonna go through it pretty quickly. Biological control of pests. There's probably gonna be like one question on the exam where I ask what it is. So let's go through this quickly. First of all, I'll point out that invasive species benefit from the absence of pathogens, predators, and herbivores, right? So again, even though we're about to talk about biological control of pests, we'll throw it back one more time to invasive species, pointing out that they outcompete native species a few ways. And again, or not again, I didn't point this out previously. Sometimes an invasive species will come to a place that doesn't have, where they don't have natural predators, right? So wherever they're from, there's things killing them, whether it be a predator or an herbivore if it's a plant, or a disease, right? So they have these things that kill it in its natural habitat, but then you take it to this new place and there's nothing to kill it, so it thrives. That's what brings us to biological control. You need to know what it is, and that's probably all you need to know for the exam. So that bullet point right there. Biological control is the release of a natural enemy to attack a pest population. It's exactly what it sounds like. Biological control. You're using something alive to control something, specifically a pest. Sometimes the pest is an invasive species, sometimes it's not. But the examples we're going to give are against invasive species. Any questions about this slide? All right, I'm trying to go quick. We only have, two more lectures, if you don't include today. An effective example of this is something called St. John's wort, which is a long-lived European weed. This is an effective example. St. John's wort is the invasive species, right? So this is what we're trying to get rid of. It's a long-lived European weed that invaded the western United States. It has overgrown millions of acres of rangeland and pasture and left few edible plants for grazing livestock. Once again, another great example. So common sense might tell you, oh, we have a new plant coming in. Plants are good for the environment, yay. But no, not in this case, right? Because it's invasive, it's not supposed to be there. And specifically, it's costing money for ranchers, people who grow livestock. Anyway, one of the reasons it did so well here is because it didn't have any natural herbivores, right? There was nothing eating it. So researchers imported leaf beetles from the native region, and that basically fixed it. It reduced the weed population to less than 5% of what it was, and that restored the land's value. Another great example too there, I like that last part, restoring land's value. So not everybody has to be a crunchy tree hugger to appreciate this stuff. Sometimes if you're just about money, sometimes that's what it's about, right? So if you don't care about the environment, because it's the environment, it's money. Anyway, any questions about that? There'll be no questions about that on the exam. All right, I'm gonna give you an example of a failure. And I will put it next to this. I don't have any questions about this on the exam either. So let's go through it very quickly. Indian mongooses, right? These are fierce carnivores. They eat rats. So they imported them into the cane fields to get rid of these rats because rats are also invasive in most places. And that rats were eating the crops. So it's like, hey, let's turn these mongooses loose so that they could eat the rats. And it's a failure because what happened was, yes, they did kill the rats, but they also killed other stuff. And then they themselves became invasive. So they were eating populations of reptiles, amphibians, and birds that were native to these areas. So they made the problem worse in this example. Another good independent work topic. And again, this could just be for 1 point if you want to keep it easy. Find another example of biological control that worked, like the St. John's wort, where they brought in beetles, or another example of where it did not work, like the Indian mongooses. And I bet you could find some with cats, because I bet people try to bring in cats to control populations of rats. But then, like I said, cats are very, very invasive. I went to a place in the middle of the Pacific called Wake Island, tiny little island. And they have like birds that can't be found anywhere else. So the U.S. government spent money to eradicate the cat population on that island because the cats were not native and they were killing the native things. Anyway, there's a picture of a mongoose about to eat the egg of some kind of native animal. Really quickly, I'm going to go through this. This is again from the old textbook. The old textbook for every chapter had something called the process of science. I'm going to skip through it. You can read about it if you want. Kudzu is a great example. If any of you are from the South, not the South Florida, I don't think it's reached there, but like the South, like Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, you should know about kudzu. It's a good example of an invasive species. Anyway, read about that if you want. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But I did leave it on the text or the slide just in case you wanted to look into it. All right. So, speaking of biological control of pests, this brings us to integrated pest management. So it's sort of looking at the same problem when you have these invasive pests, or sometimes they're not invasive, but either way, there's pests, there's some sort of living organisms that you want to get rid of. Biological control is one way to do it. Another way to do it is something called integrated pest management. So why is this so important? Agricultural operations create their own highly managed ecosystems, right? So that's basically what a farm is. If you see a cornfield, that is a highly managed ecosystem. They have genetically similar individuals, right? So again, using a cornfield as an example, usually they have like the same variety of corn, right? So that's something called a monoculture. Not that I'm going to ask you that. They're usually planted in close proximity to each other. Again, just using a cornfield as an example. I'm sure you've seen one before. And because of all these things, they kind of function as a banquet for plant-eating animals and pathogens and bacteria, and viruses, and fungi, right? So if you're something, again, using the same example, if you're something that likes to eat corn plants, whether you be an insect, like a plant-eating animal, or a bad bacteria or virus, whatever. You like corn, that's perfect for you, right? Now you have this huge area, and that's all it is corn, and everything's close, and it's all monoculture. So yeah, this is still setting up the problem. I haven't told you what integrated pest management is yet. We're just kind of setting up the problem. Why is this so important? So far as the exam is concerned, nothing important has been said. Like invasive species, most crop pests have an opportunistic life history pattern. That is something that will probably be on the exam. Most crop pests have an opportunistic life history pattern. So remember, like a type 3, that enables them to rapidly take advantage of favorable habitat. So the history of agriculture has many examples of devastating pest outbreaks. One example, and I don't remember if this is from the current textbook or the old one, but here it is. Boll weevils, that's an insect that feeds on cotton plants, both as larvae and adults. Not that I'm going to ask you that. And it's an unstoppable spread that has severely damaged local economies and had a lasting impact on the region. I'll put it next to that too. Boll weevils is just an example. And also another great independent work topic. So I gave you that example of a crop pest. So you can look up some other examples of a crop pest. Anyway, here's what they look like. There's a boll weevil. The adult, not the larva. So obviously we've set up the problem here, right? We have crop pests. They're not good. We need to take care of them. So let's talk about some ways to get rid of them. Pesticides is probably the first thing people think of, but pesticides may result in populations that are not affected by a pesticide as the result of natural selection. So we've already talked about that before, right? So you spray it down with pesticides, it kills most of them, but there's a few that are genetically, I don't know, they're stronger for some reason, so they survive, and then they reproduce, and those are the strong ones that are left. So at that point, the pesticides are not effective. Also, another bad thing about pesticides is they kill the pests that you're trying to kill, but they also kill the natural predators, right? So you have these things that you're trying to kill, some insects that you're trying to kill, but then there's also other things killing those insects. So when you spray the pesticides, you're killing the things that are trying to kill them too. And then finally, of course, pesticides don't just kill the pests, but they also kill the pollinators, right? So you need the pollinators to be able to have your crops. The reason I like this, and you can look this up for independent work as well, this is the problem, one of the problems with organic. When you talk about like organic produce and stuff like that, you can use pesticides in organic farming. It's just they have rules, and they have to be natural pesticides. Well, the problem with natural pesticides is they just kill everything. However, these scary artificial pesticides are specific, right? So if you're trying to kill a boll weevil, there's a pesticide that'll kill it and not other stuff. And that wouldn't be organic because it's artificial and scary. And natural pesticides, again, just kill everything. But that's okay because it's natural, so they can sell it as organic. Anyway, finally, this brings us to what you need to know for the exam. What in the world is integrated pest management? This uses a combination of everything we talked about, well, and some new stuff. So biological control, which we talked about earlier, previously, before this one. Chemical control, which is pesticides. And then cultural methods. And I'll give you some examples to help you understand what cultural methods means in the next few slides. But so far, that is the most important thing as far as integrated pest management is concerned for the exam. You do need to know that. So we're not talking about biological control. We're not talking about pesticides. We're not talking about cultural things. We're talking about all three. And again, I'll explain what cultural methods means in a second. That is what integrated pest management is. It also advocates for tolerating low levels of pests. So you're not shooting for total eradication. Actually, I'll back it up a second. So now what I'm about to explain is this, the cultural methods. So biological, chemical, that makes sense, right? Living things, pesticides. Cultural is this. It's kind of like what you choose to do or what you choose to tolerate. So again, low levels of pests as opposed to total eradication. Also lowering the carrying capacity for pests. That's cultural. Meaning, if you are the farmer, there's a few things you can do. These are cultural things, right? It's not necessarily biological control of pesticides, but you could use pest-resistant varieties of crop. A lot of GMOs are like that. And again, a lot of people are afraid of GMOs, but they have their advantages. Also, mixed species of planting. So instead of just having one big field full of corn, maybe you have half of it full of corn and then the other half tomatoes or something, right? So now you don't have like just one huge banquet for anything that eats corn. Now you're throwing other stuff in it. Same thing with this, crop rotation. So maybe one year you grow corn, the next year you grow soy, right? So again, that year that you're growing corn, you get all these corn pests. They're living it up. And then they come back next year looking for it, but nope, they're gone, right? Now you have soy. So now slowly the soy pests come. And then they get there. And the next year they come back. And then again, now you've got something different, right? Potatoes, whatever it may be. So again, also we use biological control and integrated pest management. Because again, as you need to know for the exam, integrated pest management is biological control and chemical control and this cultural stuff. So any questions about that? All right. And yes, this is just an example. The biological control. So gardeners a lot of times release ladybird beetles or ladybugs, however you may want to call them, because they're really good at killing aphids. But again, I put it next to that because that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you anything about ladybugs. So, any questions about integrated pest management? Moving right along. The next word for attendance is birthday. So this is the last major bullet point of this chapter. Hopefully we can knock it out. Some of you have had my 108 class, so for you this should be a big review. Let's talk about human population growth. In the few seconds it takes me to read this sentence, approximately 21 people will be born somewhere in the world and 9 will die. So in that time frame, that's how the population is changing. Notice too, more people are being born than are dying, right? So the cause of population growth or decline of any population is an imbalance between births and deaths. You definitely need to know that. That won't necessarily be a question, but that part is common sense, right? So what causes a population to grow or decline? Well, it's an imbalance, right? If you have more births than deaths, it's going to grow. If you have more deaths than births, it's going to decline. The human population is expected to continue increasing at least for the next several decades, but the number of people added to the population each year has been on the decline since the 1980s. And that'll make more sense when I show the next slide, which is going to be a graph. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click that bottom link and watch an 11-minute video on the issue of human population growth. This graph is a great graph. It's not in your textbook. It's from the old textbook. So if you want to study it, you need to download the PowerPoint. But I love it because it shows a few things. First of all, this red line is the total population, right? So that's just showing, first of all, for hundreds, thousands of years, the human population didn't change much. Then it slowly started getting bigger, and then it just kind of started exploding, right, towards the middle of the last century. And that's what that is. And of course, the old textbook, this is when it stopped. This is when it was published. So that's the latest data. But everything past that is projected data. So that's that. Now here's where it might get a little bit confusing. Let's see if you guys can figure this out. So again, the red line is the total population. But the bars here are how many people have been added to the population every year. And you can see here, starting with the 1980s, 1990s, you can see here that right there it starts declining. So why is it then that we're having fewer and fewer people being added to the population, but the population is still growing? Can anyone explain that? Yeah, I want to make sure you understand this concept before I move forward. So we're adding fewer and fewer people every year, but the population still grows.
We're living longer.
True. Actually, that's a big part of it. Yeah, that is a huge part of it. Yep.
We got medication that extends our lifeline.
Yep.
And we're living longer, and we're not, the death rate hasn't changed.
Yep. And we'll talk about that too. That is one of the things. One of the pieces is the fact that, like you mentioned, the death rate is lower than it used to be, right? So that's one of the reasons. But I want to focus on this. Here, every year since there, we're adding fewer and fewer people. But even here, as it's going down, the total population is going up. And I think the best way to think about this is money. So let's pretend like this is money for a change. Instead of total population, let's consider that the total amount of money in your bank account, right? And what you're looking at here, these bars, are how much money you are adding to your bank account. So here, this year, you added the most money you've ever added to your bank account. This year, you added less. This year, you added less. But even though you're adding less and less money to your bank account, you're still adding money to your bank account. Does that make sense? So as long as you're not spending that money, your balance is going to go up and up. Even if you're putting in less and less and less, as long as you're still putting in money more than you're taking out, your bank account is going to increase. That's what's happening with this human population. Even though we're adding fewer and fewer people every year, we're still adding people. Therefore, the population is still increasing. Any questions about that? All right. So this next bullet point, I've already told you a little bit about it, but let's talk about the history of human population growth. And you do need to know this. There will be a question about, and don't get it confused, there's probably two questions. One's going to say basically, what's been the history of human population growth? And the other one's basically going to say, all right, what's the situation with human population growth currently? All right, so through most of human history, parents used to have a lot of kids. The reason why they had a lot of kids is because death rate was so high, right? So they're kind of like hedging their bets. Right, we're going to need a lot of kids because they're not all going to make it. Also, with the economy being different the way it was back then, the more kids you had, the better off you were, right? You weren't necessarily, it was mouths to feed like it is now. But back then, too, they were also an asset. They were working on your farm, your blacksmith shop, whatever it is that you did, they did it too. So it's like slave labor, basically, right? So again, they had a lot of kids because it helped them. But again, the death rate was also high. So even though we had a lot of kids being born a lot every year, there was still barely any increase in the human population growth. And basically, as far as the exam is concerned, that's the most important bullet point right there. If you talk about the history of human population growth, for most of the human population, it's barely increased. So that will be one test question, right? So if we're talking about the history, focus on that, the history of population, human population growth, it has barely increased. But then things changed, right? Economic development in the United States and Europe and a few other places led to advances in nutrition, right? So that helped people live longer. Sanitation, that helped people live longer. Medical care, that helped people live longer, right? So because of this, people started taking control of the birth rate. So like the things Kesterson was saying earlier when I showed you that graph, like he said, population growth changed because things started getting better. People started living longer. And at first, we had a big imbalance here because once all this stuff started happening, and it happened pretty quickly, the death rate decreased, right? Because we have all these things that I mentioned earlier. Death rate decreases. However, culturally, things are still the same. People were still having a ton of kids. So now all of a sudden the population is starting to explode because, again, we're still having a bunch of kids, but the death rate has decreased. The rate of increase rose by the beginnings of the 1900s. Not that I'm going to ask you that. And by the mid-century, improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare spread to the developing world, so not just the United States and Europe, but also pretty much everywhere else, almost everywhere else, spurring a growth at a fast pace as birth rates far outstrip death rates. And so once again, like I said, culturally people just had a lot of kids, but then things started getting better, death rates started going down, and then everybody in the world eventually basically started having a lot of kids, or still had a lot of kids, but also at this point had low death rates. So the population exploded relatively recently, right? Mid-century, last century. Any questions about this slide? We have more about it on the next slide. All right, I'm not gonna ask you these numbers, but the world population skyrocketed we had 2 billion in 1927, and then we had 3 billion 33 years later. So at this point, scientists became alarmed because, hey, common sense will tell you everything's finite, right? Just like any other population, you're gonna run out of resources. So we have to be careful. What are we gonna do? So the overall growth rate peaked in 1962. Not that I'm going to ask you that. And so what happened in 1962? What caused it to peak then, right? What caused it to start going down after that? It's because developed nations had advanced medical care that continued to improve survivorship. So, that's not good. I mean, it's good, but as far as this is concerned, that's bad, right? Because we're talking about lowering the population growth rate. But we also, at that point, started having effective contraceptives that held down birth rates, right? So, like, for example, the pill, right? You can look that up for independent work. When did the pill become commercially available? Or readily available? Yeah, readily available. Anyway, so the overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the differences between birth and death rates decreased, right? So again, at that point, around 1962, yes, we still have this improvement of death rates. That's still being, the death rate is still lowering, which is good, right? We want to be able to live longer. But finally, we started taking care of the birth rate problem. And yes, it is a problem. But don't get me wrong, I don't usually share opinions in this class, but I'm of the opinion that anybody should be able to have as many kids as they want. If you want 18 kids, have 18 kids. But I'm just telling you, moving past opinions, the fact is, as far as the environment is concerned, having too many kids is not a good thing. That's just the facts. But my opinion is, do what you will. We should be free to do whatever we want as far as that's concerned. Anyway, any questions about the slide? The next slide I'm going to show you is going to be a table that kind of shows you some numbers. All right, then, there we go. There you can see here, population trends. This is from the old textbook. You can see the world compared to developed countries, compared to less developed countries. So there you go. And this should be slightly interesting to you because you might see this is kind of similar to what you did with the Ecological Footprint Lab. You might notice that poorer countries use fewer resources. No, I'll use that example. Never mind. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, I'll put it next to this, again, indicating I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. So, any questions about that? All right, let's come back to another topic that we've mentioned before. Now we're bringing it back. We're going to look at it from a different view, in a different context, which is age structures. age structures help predict the population's future growth. And the next slide that I'm going to show you is an estimated and projected age structure of Mexico in 1989. So we knew that. 2012, we knew that. And 2035, which is the projection. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but this is a good example. What you can see here, so it's kind of a pyramid shape, right? When it's really big at the bottom and small at the top, that means the population is going to grow rapidly, right? Because you have a lot of young people and fewer old people. That's basically what that means. And then you can see here, it kind of transitions from like this big pyramid to almost like a cylinder. And basically what that means is now we're having fewer, like the growth rate is starting to be under control. So we're kind of replacing, right? So it's not like, you can see here, there was this many people, but then they had a lot of kids, so then there was more people. And then they had a lot of kids, so there was more people. Then they had a lot of kids, so there was even more people. What you see here, when it's almost straight up and down, it's like saying, all right, we had this many people, and they had about the same amount of kids, so they just kind of replaced themselves. It didn't get larger. And then they will have the same amount of kids, so it doesn't get larger, it's just the same amount. Does that make sense? They're just kind of replacing themselves instead of having extra. And if anything, that's what you need to know for the exam, is this graph shape, right? So if you see a shape that's like a pyramid, that means it's growing. Of course, I don't have a picture of this, but if it was like an inverted pyramid, that would mean the population is shrinking. And of course, if it's more like a cylinder, we're talking about population replacement, right? So the population is still huge here, but we're just replacing the individuals as opposed to growing the population, right? Which brings us to this term that you need to know for the exam, maybe something called population momentum, which is the continued growth in a population that occurs after high fertility rate has been reduced to a replacement rate. Once again, I'm going to come back to this slide, and I'll back it up. That's what this is, right? Again, going from, see, it's the same size bars, meaning however many people were in that population, once they came to childbearing years, they had children, and they basically just replaced themselves, right? The population, it's still growing, but it's at a replacement rate. And that's what population momentum is. And technically, and let me circle this, that's the more important bullet point as far as the exam is concerned. But also technically, this is the result of girls who were on that graph from that 0 to 14 age, right? And then that kind of goes up, and they're no longer from the 0 to 14, they're from the childbearing years, right? And then they have kids and replace themselves. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click that link and watch a 2-minute video on population momentum. Any questions about this? All right, so why would this be important? Well, this is obviously very important as far as our lives are concerned. But even for you guys, depending on your major, this might be important to you. Age structure diagrams, so those graphs I showed you previously, indicate social conditions. So expanding population, for example, so if it's, triangle shape or pyramid shape, in that case, you're going to need more schools, you're going to need more employment, you're going to need more infrastructure, right? Because if you have it like that, that means you're adding more to the population. You're going to have more younger people than older people, right? So that would be relevant. If you're into business, right, then you need to know your demographics. If you're into criminal justice, right, typically people of different age commit different types of crimes, right? So you would need to know that if you're into criminal justice. If you're into political science, right? So again, you need to know how you need to spend your government's money. Do you need more hospitals for older people? Or do you need more schools for younger people? Things like that. Anyway, these are just examples again. This is basically the same thing I showed you earlier, except this is the United States. So same years, but instead of Mexico, it's the United States. You can see here how it bulges out, right? That's the baby boom, right? And then it starts getting lower again because of things like birth control, and lower, lower, lower. But anyway, just an example. Any questions about that slide? All right. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. This is a great example where you can learn from the shape and size of the graph, right? Stage one, this is rapid growth because not only is it a pyramid, but you can see it's curving inwards, right? So that means it's rapidly growing. Stage two, it's still a pyramid, but it's more like straight lines, right? So it's a slower growth. Stage three, it's less like a pyramid and sort of like rounding off a little bit. That's when population is stable. And then, of course, when things start getting lower at the bottom, that would be stage four. And that's when things are shrinking. The population is shrinking. Any questions about this slide? Moving right along. We might be able to finish this chapter today. I hope so. because then we'll have to do all of chapter 20 on Wednesday and Friday. All right, let's talk about our ecological footprints. I wish we could have done this before you did the lab, but because you've already done the lab, we can go through this quickly. The U.S. Census Bureau projects the global population of 8 billion. Oh, I should fix this. Because we have already hit 8 billion, right? So they were correct in that. We did hit 8 billion within 10 years. But now they also predict that we'll hit 9.6 billion by 2050. Not that I'm going to ask you this, but there you go. So the question is then, do we have sufficient resources to sustain 8 or 9 billion people? Like you've already learned from the graph or from the lab, right? We need stuff. People need stuff. You need food, you need water, you need resources, you need places to put your waste, right? So do we have enough to sustain? To do this, the world food production must increase to accommodate people expected to live in upcoming decades, but also not just to handle the expanding population, but think about it. We currently have people starving to death, right? So this isn't just an issue like how are we going to deal with more people, but how do we even feed the people that we have on Earth right now? So when I'm setting up a problem, that's still not, as far as the exam is concerned, this is unimportant. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but this is setting up a problem, right? This is why it's so important. So we already have agricultural lands that are under pressure. First of all, we have overgrazing, right? So overgrazing is turning grasslands into deserts. Then they can't be used at all. So then those animals that you were growing are dead now. Our water use is up. It's gone up 6 times in the past 70 years, where it's gone up by a factor of 6. We've had changes in precipitation that has caused food shortages in some regions. Excuse me. And because so much open space is needed to support expanding population, other species are expected to become extinct, right? So as our population grows, it's not just like that. It's like, oh, we have more people, so now we have more houses, right? I mean, that's part of it. But it's not just more houses, it's more farmland, it's more landfills, right? All the resources we need, that takes space and resources. And I put it next to this, not because it is important, just indicating there's not going to be any test questions on that. So what is your ecological footprint? As you already know, this is the estimated area of land and water, and really air, right? It's just the estimated area required to provide resources an individual or a nation consumes. So you already saw like the U.S. averages, the world averages, you calculated your own, right? So that's what your ecological footprint is. It includes, but it's not limited to things like food, fuel, housing, the ability to absorb waste, including carbon emissions, right? So all those things you already know. As far as the exam is concerned, I would say that's the most important part right there, just to know what your ecological footprint is. Not your number. I'm not going to ask you what your footprint was from the calculator, but just what is an ecological footprint. So that brings us to something you should also be familiar with from the lab, biocapacity. So when we compare our ecological footprint, right, which is our demand for resources, with the Earth's capacity to renew those resources, that's biocapacity, right? Or excuse me, biocapacity is the Earth's ability to do that, right? So that gives us a broad view of the sustainability of human activities. In short, when you did that table and you had to do the math and look at the difference is negative, that's a bad thing. That means you or we or whatever are using more resources than is being provided, right? And really quickly, I'll point this out. That might not make sense at first. Like, well, how is it that we're using more resources that are provided? Then why aren't we out of resources? Again, think of it like a bank account. The Earth has a lot of money, and every year we're spending more money that's coming in. So we still can't survive for now because we have a lot of money in the bank account, right? But every year, as we're spending more that's coming in, eventually we're going to run out. That's basically what that means. Any questions about that slide? Whew. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the average ecological footprint for the world population was 1.5 times the planet's biocapacity per person. I'm not going to ask you that. It's good to know. Again, overshooting the biocapacity means we're depleting our resources quicker than we can replenish them. The next slide compares the ecological footprints of several countries. Again, I'm not going to ask you anything about this, but you can see here is the world average footprint. See here is Earth's biocapacity. So you can see again, our world average is higher than our biocapacity, meaning we're using more than can be produced. And basically, this is what this is saying is what you already know from the lab. The richer a country is, basically, the more resources it's using. It's that simple. The poorer a country is, generally speaking, the fewer resources it's using. And it's not just a population problem either. It's not just the size of the population, but the resources that these rich countries, such as ourselves, are using. Here's a good picture to show you an example of that. Here's a kitchen in Afghanistan. It's probably kind of hard to see. And then a kitchen in the United States. Yeah. So below is a list of concepts included in the textbook that were not included in the PowerPoint, meaning you're not going to be tested on them. So I only included this. Everything past this slide, if you want to download the PowerPoint, this is stuff that is in the textbook, but I'm not going to test you on. So I wanted to put that in there because, again, I based this PowerPoint from the old textbook. I want you to look at that. That way, when you're reading the textbook, you'll be, oh, yeah, he said we're not going to be tested on that. Take a look at that. We are done with that chapter. The last word for attendance is sis, like short for sister. It's my birthday. It's my sister's birthday. And that's it. I'll see you guys on Wednesday, and we will start chapter 20. And again, if you need my help with independent work, meet me online. Let's figure things out.